So welcome everyone. This is the fourth CCUS Hub website seminar that we've been running. We're really trying to convene the various players, both industrial, but also government and NGOs and others, to bring them together on this website, exchange ideas, exchange knowledge, particularly the knowledge that we have, particularly in industry, of running these sort of hubs or starting them, and trying to allow that knowledge to proliferate throughout the CCS community so that we can have more CCS around the world and help us achieve the targets that we really need to be hitting according to a lot of the various scenarios that are out there for helping to meet the Paris Agreement temperature limitations and also net zero in the future. So we've had some other talks before. The first one we had was really quite timely because it was just timed after the IRA announcement by the US. And so we had Jen Wilcox from the government there talking with Jared Daniel, who was ex-government, of course, but now is the CEO of the Global CCS Institute. And our second one was more focused on a hub, looking at the East Coast cluster, which for those of you who remember the various names of this previously, we might refer to as an NZT, Net Zero Teesside, or even before that, the Clean Gas Project, CGP, that OGCI CI was involved in for some time as well. And our last seminar was actually covering the Northern Lights project, which was based in Norway and is actually a different model, looking at actually transporting the CO2 to the reservoir and then injecting in the reservoir. So taking it from many different customers, transporting by ship, and then storing. And this is one that's going to potentially be able to test the transboundary movement of CO2 very soon as that project ramps up. Today, however, we're going to take a slightly different tact, and we're not going to be talking about projects or government financial stimuli, etc. We're going to have a bit of a review, and this review will be of the this CO2 Capture Project that's been running for actually a considerable length of time. And it shows you just how long the two people I'll be introducing shortly have been in CCS, that they've been involved basically from the start and helping run this really successful R&D project. I won't dilly-dally any further, but I'll be handing over to two people. We've got Tony Espie from BP, who is the chairman of the CO2 Capture Project, and also Arthur Lee, who is the head of the policy group working with CCP. And they'll both do two little separate presentations talking about the work to date from the last 2 decades of CCP, plus particularly looking at the end, a reflection on the last part of CCP that's been running for the last 5 or 6 years. And I'll let them start as soon as possible and get those questions in the Q&A, please. We will try and ask any at the end to them both, and we'll have after their presentations, we'll also just have a more generic discussion and a chat about the CCP. I'll be firing them some questions, but certainly get yours down and we can add them to the list. Okay, so if I can hand over now to Tony, that would be great. Thank you.
Very good. Thanks, Ian. So good afternoon to those of you based in the UK and Europe, and good morning to anybody who's based further afield. As Ian pointed out, my name's Tony Espie, and for the last 5 years, it's been my privilege to chair the executive board of the CO2 Capture Project, or CCP as it was known. So today, what I'm going to do is share with you the story of what was one of the longest running and most productive of the global CCS technology development programs. So what we're going to run through today, I'll start out telling you a little bit about what the CCP was, how it was organized, how it evolved over time. I'll set out a few of the notable deliveries over the last 20 plus years, and this will be very much a subset of the larger set of deliverables, all of which are now in the public domain. I'll talk to the capture, the storage, and the comms activities, and then I'll hand over to my colleague Arthur Lee, who'll talk about the policy and incentives activities that were undertaken. And then finally, we'll sum up with a few reflections on the ups and downs of managing a program across 20 years. So next slide. So let's start with what the CCP was all about, how it worked. Next slide. So CCP was a joint industry project. That's to say it was a collaboration between major international companies from the oil and gas sector. It had some specific objectives, so it funded technology developments with the potential to make a significant reduction in cost. So that objective was largely focused on reducing cost of capture. Second major area was addressing stakeholder concerns around the effectiveness of storage and the long-term viability of storage as a greenhouse gas mitigation option. And then finally, the work was undertaken to review systematically the existing policy frameworks to identify gaps and blockers to large-scale deployment of CCS. So that was then all supplemented, supported with an active comms program that aimed to provide sort of clear, authoritative information to a range of different stakeholders. Next slide. So how did the CCP work? It used a pseudo-funding council model, I think is the clearest analogy. So it worked to channel funds to technology developers in both the capture and storage spaces. And a conscious decision was taken that the most value that CCP could get from its investments was to focus on those things which were already partly through the development cycle. So proof of concept had been established and the technology vendors were busy making their way through that so-called valley of death, so that the area where costs are going up for them and it becomes a lot more difficult to get funding. So that's where CCP chose to play. And that was meant that we placed quite a strong emphasis on the execution of field trials. So what to say is that the funding for that funding council model came from a combination of subscriptions coming from the member companies of the CCP, together with grants from national governments around the world. And over its lifetime, CCP invested of order $100 million. And that was split roughly 50-50 between private investment and public investment. The CCP was organized into work streams: capture, storage, policy and incentives, and comms. Those work streams were staffed by members who worked for the member companies. And their brief was basically to remain abreast of what state of the art was in technology development in their respective areas, to identify potential opportunities, to work with the technology developers to get robust proposals together that were fully fully costed, that CCP could fund. Those proposals were then brought to the executive board under me, and the executive board took a view around the the overall fit with CCP objectives, the fit with the budget, and the overall doability. And that included a subjective analysis of what we felt the probability of success of individual opportunities looked like. Next slide. So many ways that those set of low carbon capture and storage technologies can be deployed. So to keep this anchored in the real world, the CCP identified a number of specific scenarios that were proposed by the member companies. There were 4 of those initially. One was a refinery scenario focused on heaters and boilers. One, or at least 2 of the scenarios were focused around gas turbines. One was a large gas turbine case, which was focused on power generation. The other one was much smaller distributed gas turbines of the sort which are used by oil and gas operators for compression and movement of fluids around their facilities. And then finally, we had one gasification scenario which looked at a range of solid fuels. I did mention, and I'll touch on it again in the next slide, that there had been some evolution of thinking through the 20 years of the CCP, and that's reflected a little bit in some of the scenarios. So you see that most of those scenarios are actually focused on EOR as the storage vehicle for these things, and that was really because going back to 2000, saline aquifer storage was still felt to be a relatively risky proposition. And say by the time we got to the end of the CCP, I think that position had pretty much reversed, and saline aquifer storage is almost the default these days, with a much reduced reliance on storage in hydrocarbon reservoirs. Not total, but that balance has certainly shifted. Next slide, please. So final slide in this sort of what and how section. 20 years is quite a long time for a project to keep running. There has been quite a lot of evolution during that time. So CCP1, the first 5-year period, really focused on screening and proof of concept. What that did was then to identify a subset, significantly smaller subset of the initial technology screened as having significant opportunity to reduce costs and move some way towards meeting the overall targets of cost reduction. Second phase of CCP, 2004 to 2009, focus in on those higher potential technologies and put together plans by which they could be taken through to pilot testing. So intensively working, getting all of the design work in place to be able to pilot test. And then CCP3 was really the first of the demonstration phases for CCP4. And then the last phase, which has been my tenure as the chair of the exec board, has been a bit of a combination of bringing technologies through and testing them. So it was realized that in that 15-year period of CCP1 to CCP3, there were things that hadn't been picked up in the first instance, but had matured sufficiently to warrant bringing them through. And we picked up a number of those technologies in CCP4. All right, next slide. So many deliverables over 20 years, and what I'll give you is just a taster of what has been done, and I would encourage those of you who want to learn more to go onto the CCP website, and we'll give you that website address at the end. So CCP 1 through 3, the first 3 options. So the capture team screened over 200 separate technologies, and a significant part of that was putting those technologies all onto a common basis. What we saw back in 2000 was that work which did exist in the literature tended to suffer from all having different sets of assumptions around how CCP projects, CCS projects should and would work. The differences in those assumptions actually led to differences in costs, which were as large as those associated with the underlying technologies themselves. So everything was put onto a common cost basis, and that was the first time that had been done. And perhaps not surprisingly, what was seen at that stage was a lot of the technology costs actually rose before they started to come down again. We identified a small subset of that 200 capture technologies. It was on the order of about a dozen were identified as high potential that were worth taking forward to the next stage, and they were worked up in CCP2. And then in the third phase, CCP3, we carried out field demonstrations of oxy-firing for both fluid catalytic cracking and once through steam generators. So both oil field processes. Storage team focused in, I would say, on 3 specific areas. So the development of risk-based methodologies, particularly for looking at saline aquifers, was something that CCP1 was very heavily involved with, and a lot of the things which came out of that are still in use today. Second area of major interest was focus on well integrity and going back to the beginning, there was a lot of concern that the cements, which are typically used in oil field processes, wouldn't be adequate for CCS. So if you put a chunk of Portland cement in acidified brine, then it tends to deteriorate very fast. So what CCP did was to go to a CO2 production field where a well had been in contact with CO2 for the best part of 20 years. And we took sidewall cores through the casing and through the cement at a number of different heights in the casing. And we were able to show that the deterioration of the cement was actually very slow. So over 20 years, the CO2 front had moved a few feet into the cap rock, and it validated the view that CO2 degradation of cement wasn't actually dominated by equilibrium chemistry, which is what happens when you drop a chunk in acidified brine. It was actually a transport and storage problem. So it's dominated by the kinetics of getting fresh brine to your cement and then getting your reaction products away. And those are completely different processes. A lot of preparatory work for monitoring was done during that time. the slide that we've jumped onto is the last 5 years, CCP4. So in that time, we've continued with the capture work, looking at field testing, so post-combustion, looking at testing of piperazine at the NCCC facility in Alabama, field testing of novel fast cycle temperature swing absorption, testing of 3D printed structured absorbents, and starting to move into the engineering realm of looking at being able to separate CO2 from natural gas on the seabed. So very close to source rather than having to bring it to surface. Storage, a lot of work was done on mitigation. So a purpose-built section of a full-size well was drilled in the Monterrey underground rock facility in Switzerland. Cement behind the casing was deliberately fractured, and then we were able to test the ability of a number of different sealants to be able to plug that. A number of field trials of monitoring technologies done at the Aquastor facility in Canada. And then we looked at the Cranfield site in southern US to look and see if we could understand actually the breakdown of the trapping mechanisms within the Cranfield CO2 EOR process. I've really not mentioned the comms piece very much, but there was a stream of material put out. All of the reports from CCP have been put onto the CCP website in the form of a book series. So you'll be able to find 5 volumes of reports on that website. So that brings me to all I was going to say about the capture, the storage, and the comms activity. At this stage, I'll hand over to Arthur Lee to talk about the policy and incentives work.
Thank you very much, Tony. First of all, let me acknowledge really Tony's wonderful leadership in phase 4 of the CO2 Capture Project. And secondly, I apologize for my voice. I've been battling a cold in the last week, and I think I've lost my voice for 2 days now. So I'm kind of still recovering from that. But I'll do the best I can, and if there's any questions at the end, I'll certainly try to respond if you couldn't quite understand me. But the main thing is that the policy and incentives team has been around not quite at the beginning of phase 1. I was actually Texaco's. That's how long ago this project has been. I was Texaco's representative on the board from the get-go and accompanied one of our general managers to the meetings and represent some of the technical, to represent Texaco's more technical expertise on the board for a couple of years. And then it was in 2004 that with policies that the gaps that we're seeing, that it was important to begin a team, a formal team to, next slide, thank you, to really begin a formal team on policy and incentives at the middle of 2004, which was near the end of phase 1 of the CO2 Capture Project. So we began life in 2004 as an advisory team to the board to really talk to the board whenever there are questions around whether certain policies would be needed or will have to be really developed by government to be able to move forward with our technology development. And that's how we began life, as really as an advisory team. And at the same time, we're starting to realize that we also needed to do a survey of the global development of any kind of policies that could be in CCS. And it was at this time that when we did our first legislative policy regulatory survey of CCS around the world, we realized that much of the world's oil and gas and minerals laws and regulations were perhaps most applicable to CCS because there was really nothing on the books at that time, as early as 2004. At most, there would be in the U.S., of course, regulations on enhanced oil recovery or EOR using CO2. And that was the best analog that we could find, even for CO2 storage, and that was only in the really in the United States. So that's how we began this regulatory survey, and then one of the things that we got onto that was a major study for us, and that was completed in 2000, sometime in 2006, which we were only able to publish in 2008, was a study on pipeline infrastructure. Now, so CCP, I don't know we can take credit for being first to come up with this study, but certainly when we were doing this, we surveyed the literature, and there was very little about CO2 pipeline infrastructure, except for some dedicated pipelines in the United States that were taking CO2 from the McElmo Dome in southwest United States to various EOR fields, and that was the only survey we could find for that kind of extensive CO2 pipeline. But at the same time, we needed to start thinking about CO2 pipeline infrastructure and how they would be financed. And this is important for us, of course, in those early days. Even obviously we didn't think it was early days, but we were thinking that to deploy CCS much more widely, we really do need to think about infrastructure immediately. And so some of the earliest thinking that we did at the time was to do an estimate of even how much CO2 pipeline infrastructure one would need, for example, in the US, of how much you would need to even to be able to reduce emissions at the scale of, say, 1 billion tons, okay, globally. But even in the US would be a few 100 million tons in the next decades. So that kind of pipeline infrastructure, we already had a very back of the envelope estimate that the CO2 pipeline will have to be built out to more than just a few hundred miles, but thousands of miles of CO2 infrastructure. That would be almost comparable to the order of magnitude of the infrastructure of the petroleum infrastructure in the U.S. Okay, so that's what motivated us to really think about the financing aspect of this, and that's when we published the paper. We did the research and published the paper in 2008, which is the cover page that I show here on the right. And it was really, I think, the first paper, again, doing the literature's survey, we really think it was the first paper, the pioneering paper to really think about financing this kind of infrastructure. And we looked at point-to-point kind of infrastructure, or we also looked at kind of a trunk line, main trunk line infrastructure with feeders and distributors to the storage sites. and the different kind of financing that we would need. And some of the early results we found, of course, were that the governments really did need to provide the kind of help that we would need as an industry to build up that infrastructure to such a large scale. As much as loan guarantees could be helpful, would certainly help to defray the risk of some of the first movers, if there were any first movers who would build this infrastructure. So at the very least, loan guarantees would be the most important for this development. And it's the capital cost, of course, would be offset by some of the capital cost incentives that we believe governments would have to supply to the industry to be able to build this infrastructure. So think about this. This was published in 2008, okay, and we were thinking about this as early as around 2005. So we continue to work on surveys of policies and regulations in other years throughout the project, phase 2 and then phase 3. And then we then started thinking about how the emergence of some of the CO2 capture some of the CO2 CCS projects around the world, such as the projects from BP and Statoil in those days. Equinor was called Statoil. Statoil and BP's project in Inshallah was one project. Of course, Statoil's project in the North Sea, really looking at any kind of regulations, and also in the North America it was the Weyburn project, the so-called Weyburn-Midale project. We also looked at possible regulatory models that could come out of those projects. I know some of these projects people may not even remember, but here I am. I guess this is my job here to remind folks that there were some of these pioneering projects from around the world, including Chevron's own project that was sanctioned in 2006, the Gorgon project. So a lot of these early projects really started to provide, if not the full model, really start to thinking about the kind of policies that we really need in the subsurface. And finally, we looked at stakeholder concerns I think in phase 2, around phase 2, beginning of phase 3, looking at some of these additional projects and the start of permitting. This is when we can actually start thinking about permitting in the beginning of phase 3, and what that means for the speed of development, the speed of deployment of actual projects. So we did a survey of stakeholders, of some local stakeholders, but mostly national and some global stakeholders, including several environmental groups, major environmental groups. And already in those early days, in the mid 2000s, we already found that there were groups that were aligned with us, environmental groups such as the Clean Air Task Force and also environmental defense. They were much more aligned with us than other NGOs that were really dead set against these kind of projects and the deployment of CCS technologies. Next slide, please. And we also then looked at local communities as well, looking at analogs of other kinds of industrial projects that have been built, not just in the oil and gas industry, but in other industries, in the power sector, for example, and dams, in hydropower, for example, is another example. So we did a full report, really a comprehensive report on that as well, looking at these stakeholders' concerned, but also what some of these other industrial projects did to share benefits with local communities when they have to site these projects in certain locations. What we found is that the local benefits sharing has been indeed effective for many of the industries that we surveyed, including, I have to say, including some of the waste incineration facilities and also waste treatment, power projects, refineries, and others. So we've looked at a whole landscape of these other industries and found that local, whenever these projects deploy much more local benefit sharing, including the help with community public health, community infrastructure, helping communities with their not only public health issues, water issues, and infrastructural transportation issues. All those educational aspects of local benefits, all of those have helped in these other industries. And that's the result of our report that we survey. That using these local benefits, it is possible to be able to persuade that the local communities, in addition to the employment that would be obtained through these projects, that it could be very helpful to the deployment of CCS projects, CCS technologies. And then we continue with surveys of policies and regulations. By this time, towards the end of phase 3, we're finding that there are more CCS regulations. Certainly, as we all know, in 2009, the EU CCS directive was already promulgated. So by 2009, there was already, and this was, I recall the timeline, was early phase 3. We already have CCS projects. Okay, so so that we already have policies and regulations coming on the books. Now, let me just try to speed up here, and then in the later stages, starting the beginning of phase 4. Despite what the reverse in EOR and saline aquifers, it was still important for us to understand jurisdictions such as the state of Texas in the United States and the province of Alberta, where there were a lot of discussion and certainly a lot more oil and gas production facilities historically. So enhanced oil recovery in those jurisdictions was certainly a very logical extrapolation of policies and regulation. So we conducted an analysis that gave us very detailed understanding of what this means for transitioning EOR projects to become CO2 storage projects. And so a study was done on that as well. Now, one of the major studies at the end of, towards the end of phase 4, was essentially complete, I think, by the end of 2018, was the study on CCS in the energy transition. And and this is the cover page of that study. Let me move on to the next slide, please. And perhaps, like anything in policies and regulations, policies can change, regulations don't change as quickly because of their legal nature, but policies by governments can often change when governments change. But what I'm saying here is that this particular graphic will illustrate perhaps one of the more robust and enduring findings through all 4 phases of our studies, is that CCS really has been found by different and independent analysis and analysts, such as the IEA, or such as the Deep Decarbonization Pathways Project that existed in the late 2010s, and also the Global CCS Institute itself, MIT, there used to be an MIT Carbon Sequestration Initiative that lasted from 2000 to 2016, when finally published by MIT in 2017. All these studies, for example, really showed CCS to be the critical technology in order to reach deep decarbonization. And of course, some of these later studies really confirmed the fact that that the IPCC, which later found this also to be true, and this IPCC is not even listed here, that all of these analysis, by independent analyst teams, have really found CCS to be critical. for now reaching the Paris Agreement, the long-term goals. And these results have been robust for a long time, not just from the IPCC in the last few years, but as early as, say, I'll cite it here, 2014. But there's been studies even before that. But I think the point here is that CCS is critical for anything we wish to do in terms of deep decarbonization globally in order to reach the Paris Agreement long-term goals. Next slide, please. Now, I won't go into any details here, but the point is, this last study that we did that was completed in 2018 really did a very comprehensive analysis of all the regulations and policies and regulations that we had up to that time, including the emergence of laws and regulations too that would start allowing companies to look for CCS storage space. So this analysis I would commend to you is the last study we did. Now again, I know things can get outdated, but really this was still a very robust set of findings from the energy transition study, really looking at all these laws and regulations that are still applicable today, including for some of us the importance of the London Protocol about transboundary CO2 transport. So I'll just leave it there and turn it back over to Tony. And apologies again for my voice. Sorry.
Thanks, Arthur. Just finish up with a few reflections on the last 20 years. The next slide. So I think it's fair to say that the last 20 years have been a bit of a bumpy ride for CCS. Lots and disappointments, but ultimately, we have moved a very long way from 2000, where CCS was an largely unknown option, to today, where it's recognized as an absolutely essential piece of the arsenal to deliver our aspirations. And I think the CCP has benefited from a number of choices that it made in the way it was set up. It always had a long-term vision, and that longevity of its vision and its funding cycles helped a lot to take it through some of the low points where governments changed positions in not very helpful ways, but that was one of the things that we managed to keep going through the companies. Second, I think the industry government developer model worked very well. It was very effective in triggering innovation, and in part, I think the CCP contributed to helping build capacity and capability within the technology supply chain for CCS, which is a key thing needed to be able to take things forward. So final thing I'd say is that there were two strategic decisions that were taken by CCP, which benefited its delivery quite a lot. First of these was decision to focus on the higher TRL activities. So there was already a lot of money going, largely government money, going into sort of university level research. By focusing on things which were further down that development pathway, and in particular helping to get some field trials done, I think CCP made some very useful contributions to the advance of CCS. Second thing was that CCS took a conscious decision not to try and develop its own test centers, either for capture or for storage, but rather to facilitate developers testing their products at existing test centers. So places like the NCCC in Alabama, places like Aquastor in Canada, places like Monterrey in Canada, in Switzerland, and that freed up a very significant amount of money that could be focused on the technologies themselves rather than building up project infrastructure. And overall, a very strong focus on sharing results. So all of the results of that last 22 years are now accessible on the CCP website. So busy, productive, at times frustrating, but ultimately a fairly exhilarating 20 years. So at that point, we'll wind things up, and I think the CO2 capture website should be on the next slide. Yeah. So that's the material we have to present, and we can pick up on a conversation at this point. So back to Iain.
Thanks, Tony, and thank you to Arthur for tripping through. You've got a bit of a cold there, I see. So thank you very much for continuing on. One of the things I first sort of saw when you started talking about the CCP was the fact you've got these GIPs, GIPs. But you've got a really interesting way that you are also working with the European Union and others within the lifetime of the CCP. And so I'd just like you to sort of talk through about how those were created and what do you think were the success factors in making that collaboration work?
Yes. So going back to the very beginning, so 2000, we worked up a proposition around what we would like to do with the CCP, and we took that to the US Department of Energy. After a year or so of toing and froing, they agreed that they would put up a substantial amount of money, so several $1 million, which would be their contribution to programs that the CCP would then manage. So that was one aspect. Then as we went forward a little bit further in time, it became a case of it taking individual proposals to the funding agencies, whether that was the DOE, whether it was the European Union, or whether it was Gassnova in Norway. A bit of an evolution, I would say, in the way in which that happened.
Yeah, if I could add something there as well, I was not directly involved in that kind of fundraising, but certainly we acknowledge very much in those early days in phase one, especially phase one, and some of phase two, that the DOE's funding and the EU, I think, framework program number 5 and 6, I think, were very helpful in co-funding much of the technology selection projects that I can recall. So, thank you.
There's always that question about how willing any given funding agency is to fund work which is taking place outside their borders. And we have to absolutely thank DOE for their flexibility in being willing to fund stuff outside the immediate borders of the US. So they did fund work in Canada, and they contributed to some work in Europe as well.
Yes.
Great, thank you very much. Good answer. I'll ask one more directly to Arthur this time, picking up on some of the things he said. So, Arthur, you mentioned that the policies can change quite quickly, and I'd like you to reflect over the last 20 years, because at the moment it feels like a really exciting policy development and lots of stuff going on. But how does that feature compared to the last 20 years or so that you've been involved in policy development? Are we at a new height of sort of policy craze and new stuff going on, or has this been seen before and we've been in these peaks and troughs?
Well, I like to think of myself as an optimistic person. I think, as I said early on, when we first started, there really was nothing. The closest thing was the U.S. the U.S. EOR, any kind of EOR regulation, and of course mining regulation for minerals. Those kinds of regulation were the closest that we could find that perhaps could be adapted to do this, to do CCS. Now let me I forget. I'm remiss in forgetting to say this. The CO2 Capture Project has never been a lobbying organization, and the policy team was not a lobbying team. We were not lobbyists. All of the team members were engineers or scientists, and so we were not lobbyists. So our team only did studies and did not do any lobbying. Now that did not, of course, mean that we didn't advocate for the good, positive nature of our technologies. So we did do advocacy work in the public forums, such as the CO2, such as the Conference of Parties at the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the policy negotiation. So we appeared in side events at almost every one of those COP events to promulgate the studies, the latest studies we have done on policies. So we've done that over many years, and we did contribute, for example, to the global policy development of the Clean Development Mechanism, the CDM, which finally, after 6 years from COP 12 to COP 18, that is from 2006 to 2012, I think it was 2006 to 2012, really started including in the United Nations framework the fact that CCS projects are now eligible in the Clean Development Mechanism. Now that's just one example of changes, because as I just said, there was nothing, right? And then finally in 2012 we had a bit of a victory, and the CO2 Capture Project contributed to that victory of having CCS project become eligible for CDM, and that too, I think is an example of the kind of changes that eventually we're starting to see now, that national government policies are now finally catching up with the fact that CCS is critical to reaching the Paris Agreement goals. So therefore, national policies are now really going much more rapidly, and in terms of, for example, in the U.S., we now all know that the Inflation Reduction Act really does have a lot of incentives in there that will help the pipeline CCS project to be developed, and that is good news. And of course, most recently, as we know, last week the European Commission had proposed the Net Zero Industry Act, NZIA. That Net Zero Industry Act will also spur, I hope, will spur in the right direction more development of of incentives by revising the state aid rules in the EU, so that a member state can provide more incentives to the deployment of CCS projects in Europe. So I think that will certainly be helpful. And indeed, I think we are now living in much more exciting times. The only big drawback now I see is whether the local permitting regulations in any of these jurisdictions, in the US, North America, or anywhere else, EU, whether the permitting regime could also be streamlined. It is now the permit side of things that could be a problem. Not only permits to site those storage sites to allow storage, but also the permits to even explore for storage space. I think that too has to be done much faster so that CCS can become much more of a contributor to reaching the Paris Agreement goals. So I'll just leave it at that. I think it's exciting times, but we still have to really watch this space to get the incentives and the regulations in place to speed things along. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the excellent answer, Arthur. Looking at the time, I'm a bit hesitant to ask another question. I was going to dive into a technology one for you, Tony, but I think we have to sort of wrap it up about now so that everyone else can have a quick...
Could I, I'm sorry, I was remiss in acknowledging someone in the audience, Raja Jadaf of Chevron. He was actually in phase 4, the member of the executive board serving alongside Tony, and is also the capture project, capture technology team leader. Dean Thornton too is also a service team leader. So, okay, so the dog is not on any of the teams, but we should acknowledge the dog as well for contributing. Thank you.
Yes, apologies for my dog. So we'd like to wrap it up there. We will be doing a number of other webinars in the near future, and we look forward to seeing you there. Thank you very much for attending, and please check the website. You'll see the webinar recorded there. All the data for reports is available from the website that Tony's talked about. And is there. I see a few more questions have come in, but unfortunately it's now too late to answer those. But we'll look at them and try and get back to those people individually if possible. So thank you very much for all attending. Thank you, Tony, and thank you, Arthur, for giving up your time this afternoon to introduce the CCP to the audience. And thank you very much, all.